and good evening. I'm Melisa Idris. Welcome to The Future is Female. This is the show where we find the extraordinary in every woman. I am coming to you today from this year's Khazanah Megatrends Forum, at which my guest will be one of the speakers today. I'm delighted to welcome to the show Dr. Alice Evans. She's a senior lecturer in the Social Science of Development at King's College London. Dr. Evans is writing a book titled The Great Gender Divergence, which aims to explain why some societies have become more gender equal than others. So let's get her thoughts today. Dr. Evans, thank you so much for being on the show with me. Let's talk a little bit about the Great Gender Divergence. Maybe you can tell us a little bit about the central question that you're aiming to answer through your work and research. What is that question that you're most eager to answer?
Thank you so much. Thank you, Melissa. Right, so let's talk about the future being female. So, the entire world has become more gender equal. You know, just yesterday I was chatting to two young women here in Kuala Lumpur, and they were saying, you know, how their mothers had been in arranged marriages. But for them, they're university graduates, like many young women in Malaysia with rising university enrollment, and they can choose their own husbands, and they're being selective, right? They want a man who loves them, who respects them, who cherishes them, and supports them. You know, that's an advance of gender equality, and we see this all over the world. But the rate of progress varies enormously. You know, in some societies, like much of the Middle East, South Asia, North Africa, men take on the lion's share of providing for their families, organizing politically, making the laws of the land. You know, other places like Latin America have seen massive feminist progress, feminist marches, rising employment. Others, it's a bit stagnant, a bit slow, South Asia. And so what I'm doing, perhaps naively, is studying the cultural evolution of every single society in the world, going back thousands and thousands of years using history, archaeology, artifacts, so looking at all these digital images online and doing interviews. So I've done qualitative research in 9 world regions. You know, I've lived in slums, in swamps, in villages, in all kinds of places, not like this fancy venue at all, chatting and living with local families and understanding their concerns, understanding how things have changed over generations and what's driving that change and why it varies.
Okay, so you're midway through, but you're still deep in the research. But talk to me about what you found. And before we do get into that, I'm curious to know how you define and quantify gender equality in your analysis. And I'm just wondering whether it's more nuanced than just having equal rights, equal opportunities, equal responsibility. Is there more than that you're looking at?
Absolutely, great point. So I think we should look at everything. There are many different facets so we can think about. So generally we can think about, you know, authorities. Some figures are high status, they command deference, they're treated with respect, whereas others are low status. You know, they're expected to do the menial work and, you know, appreciate others, right? But that plays out in lots of ways. We can think about gender-based violence. We can think about women's autonomy. We can think about various levels of freedoms. We can think about employment. We can think about sexism, even things like mansplaining, right? Those tiny little things. So are women respected as leaders and how this varies by class, etc. So I totally agree. And we can look at attitudes, right? So if we look at Malaysia's survey, I think it's 80% of Malaysian men believe or endorse the claim that when jobs are scarce, men have greater right to employment. But women disagree. Women in Malaysia are much less likely to agree with that claim. So we can look at, so what I do is I triangulate all kinds of data, both the quantitative data on female employment, leadership, support for that, and also my conversations with all kinds of women and men right across the world, across different generations.
So that's fascinating. What are the factors that come into play here? Is it history? How much in terms of history is important in shaping gender dynamics? You say the world is getting more gender equal. So how much does the kind of legacy of the past come into play for some societies?
Okay, let me address that in 2 parts. Great question. So first, I think one of the most powerful engines of gender equality is actually economic growth, right? Over the past 20th century, we've seen economic growth in many places, especially Malaysia. And with that skill-biased technological change, it means that families increasingly have the revenue, the money to send their kids to school. So women are getting educated, as I said, and Malaysian women have entered the workforce. You know, Malaysian tertiary graduates, they're much more likely to work because they can get jobs that are psychologically enjoyable, culturally respected, and also they can afford to then pay for care, etc. So job creating economic growth is super, super important, and that's something that Malaysia can do more of, right? We know that lots of graduates will struggle to find jobs at the right level of skill. So creating more good jobs is super, super important for Malaysia to enable that continued progress towards gender equality. Because if you compare, for example, the women who are trapped in the villages, right? And who have very few exit options, right? And once you've got 2 or 3 kids, you don't have your own job, you're kind of dependent on your husband. So even if he's mean, even if he's abusive, you kind of have to endure that. Yeah. So job creating economic growth, boom, super powerful. So is technological change, right? So in previous generations, I'm sure your grandmother and my grandmother would have had to do an enormous amount of drudgery, right? The washing, the cleaning, the ironing, right?
Right.
Right, now you and I can put things in the microwave, boom, 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 and get on with our day. So technological change can be liberating, but it's mediated by culture. So in the Middle East, North Africa, South Asia, male honor depends on female seclusion, right? So a man gains his status in society by policing his sisters and daughters, keeping them close to the home and restricting their freedom. So, you know, I've done research for a month in Uzbekistan, 2 months in South Asia. I hiked across the Atlas Mountains in Morocco. I've done research for months in Turkey, in southeastern Turkey. And for there, you know, male honor is so important that men actually would rather their wives don't go into work because they're worried about rumors. You know, there was a wonderful randomized controlled trial in Mumbai in India by Suhani Jalota and Lisa Ho, and they found that even when they offer slum-dwelling women like $200 a month in a nice office with just other women, they don't take that job because their husbands say no, and male honor is so important. Now, Southeast Asia is different, right? Indonesia and Malaysia, their levels of female labor force participation are about 53%, right? Much higher than places like Egypt, where it's down like 20%. Why is it different? And you're right, history matters, right? Okay. So I love talking about history. So as you know better than me, Islam spread to Southeast Asia via trade, via missionaries, not through force. And so that means it assimilated and adopted with local Hindu Buddhist cultures, right? Do you know, just yesterday I was chatting to this amazing hijabi Malaysian, but originally Javanese lawyer who's also a dancer. Wow. And she was telling me all about Javanese dancer, and she, you know, she's a very practicing devout Muslim, but in Java they do these dances, and it incorporates many Hindu Buddhist ideals. She was even explaining how this means the fire being grounded, and that's similar to, you know, Hindu Buddhist concepts. So all these, this is a melting pot, right? This is the great strength of Southeast Asia, this diversity, and it's wonderful. And as you may admire from my jacket in Central, you know, when I went to Central Market yesterday, I saw all this diversity, right? You see all the Hindu art, the Buddhist art, and it's this melting pot of people coming together, incorporating different ideas. So one, you have that, the heterogeneity of different cultures, and 2, because Islam spread through trade, it did not institutionalize patrilineal kinship, this idea of following descent down the male line. So there's this strong ideal of bilateralism. Like if you look at the gender complementarity in many of the sort of ancient practices, there's ancestor worship where it's both the male figure and the female figure, right? That complementarity. Whereas in many, for example, in Rajasthan or in Uzbekistan, when they look at their family genealogies, the family tree, it only features men. Right? Ancestor worship in China, for example, only features men.
Wow, so the women are not even...
It's totally wiped out.
Invisible.
So it's all about the patrilineal inheritance traced through the male line, that the male are reproducing. Yes, so it's totally different, right? So in Southeast Asia, women always travel freely. You know, in the 11th century, Chinese traders came to Southeast Asia, and they saw like women traveling long distances as traders, as go-getters, you know, being super entrepreneurial and active. Like that's a very deep part of Southeast Asian history, and you've had so many of these Malaysian queens, and you know, lots of queens around
here. Could you drill,
yes,
maybe drill down a little bit as to what triggers that cultural change? I'm sure it happens slowly and through many decades and generations, but are societies that have been traditionally or culturally very patriarchal, does that eventually change into becoming more gender equal? And what changes society's mindset and frame of thinking?
Okay, great point. So I call this the honor-income trade-off. So in societies where male honor depends on female seclusion, yes, female employment will rise in response to more economic opportunities, right? So when there are more jobs in India, women will increasingly seize those jobs. But when male honor is so paramount, then families may forego that because they think that honor is more important. Like in Pakistan, right? Female employment is still very low. They just don't want to seize those jobs, no matter how desperate you are. In fact, in what we find in India, for example, as families become wealthier, they may withdraw women from the labor force in rural areas in order to gain respect. Now, you don't have that in Malaysia. Actually, Malaysia's economic growth has enabled more female employment because you don't have those strong ideals of female seclusion, right? So if you don't have that male honor syndrome, then boom, seize those economic opportunities. But again, you know, that will vary heterogeneous. So if you look at, so earlier this year I was in Hong Kong. You know, in Hong Kong, in Chinese culture, there's this strong ideal of thinking about, you know, amassing wealth, amassing fortune. You know, if you go to our little shops, you'll see the money tree, good fortune, the lucky cat with the paw bringing more money. Yeah. When I was in Hong Kong's Lunar New Year festival, it's all about the fish of abundance. So if you highly value economic returns, and also in Chinese imperial bureaucracies, the men trained for the civil service exams, right? So education is super, super important because it's with the gateway to upward mobility. And it was really revered in mythology, in stories, the idea that the three classics about education, that's super, super important. The idea of like even a peasant son could become a high-ranking official, right? So if you've got that mentality that you really worship the god of wealth, or you love this idea of, you know, money, good fortune, and you privilege education, then what we find with Chinese communities across the world is they're really prioritizing income, right? So when it comes to that honor-income trade-off, Chinese communities all over, whether it's Singapore, Hong Kong, Malaysia, they're thinking, no, I want to make money, right? That's much, much more important. So, boom, female employment goes right up at a lower level of wealth, right? Because they're really prioritized. So we do see that cultural heterogeneity. So even here in Malaysia, you see higher levels of female education and female employment among the Chinese population. So if we look at Malaysian women under 29, about 90% of those Chinese Malaysian women are working, whereas for Malay Malaysians, it's more like 70% or so. So it's quite a big difference.
Well, you are here at the Khazanah Megatrends Forum to give a feature address on how to boost the Malaysian workforce.
Yes.
Okay, and you've done some research clearly in this area. What are we looking at? How are you thinking about the Malaysian workforce when you put on a gender lens?
Okay, so I actually have two lenses.
Oh.
Yes. So one, I am a lecturer in international development, so I'm very interested in how countries can get rich, right? I want Malaysia to prosper. Boom, I support that. But two, I also think about gender and culture, right? So I'm looking at the interconnections between the two. So structural transformation, you really want a big workforce. You know, people are innovators, people are ideas, people are entrepreneurs, people make discoveries, right? So we really want to harness that big work. We want to grow the workforce. How can we do that? There are two big levers. One is fertility, right? You want a youthful population because young people, they're more likely to innovate, they've got higher labor productivity, they're more likely to be entrepreneurial. Older people, they can be, no offense, you know, a kind of a drain on resources. You've got a higher dependency ratio, that's a loss of government revenue. So you want a big youthful population. Now, Malaysia is going to be an aging society by 2050. Right? So you've got more and more old people. That's a big burden for everyone else to support. So then you've got a question of how can you support fertility? So if I talk briefly about fertility, so what we've seen across the world, that fertility rates have plummeted. Yeah. And that's definitely happening here in Malaysia. So even among Malaysians, the total fertility rate, that is the number of children each woman might expect to have in her lifetime, is around 2. And it's even lower.
It's the replacement rate.
Yes, exactly. And it's even lower for Chinese Malaysians. And it's fallen a lot. And also for Indians. And so why is this happening? So I think maybe there are two main reasons. So the economist Gary Becker highlighted the quality-quantity trade-off. So parents either think, do I want quantity? Do I want loads of kids, you know, a big workforce to work in the fields? Or do I want quality? Do I want to really, really invest in their education? And across the world, because of this skill-biased technological change, the rising returns to skills, parents are investing a lot in their kids' education, right, to help them prosper in this very meritocratic, you know, or skill-biased societies. And as a result, but what we're now seeing is this educational arms race, right? So the richest parents, they may send their kids to international schools, private tuition. You know, I think the vast majority of Malaysian parents are sending their kids to private tuition.
Private school.
Yeah, exactly. So that becomes emotionally draining, right? It's super, super exhausting. One, not only in terms of cost, but also in terms of the mentality. Am I optimizing my child? You know, when I look at World Value Survey, over 60% of Malaysians are really concerned about their children's education, and that's above the global average. So one, you have this educational arms race where every parent is trying to optimize their child, and it just makes it so tough. That's one aspect. We also find across countries that fertility is higher when men do a larger share of the childcare, right?
Oh,
yeah,
interesting.
exactly.
Okay.
So when men signal that they're going to be engaged fathers, that they're going to support you, because we know across the world, well, in many countries, that when women become mothers, that takes a hit to their pay. Maybe they have to take a more flexible job, part-time job, etc. So if they know that a man is going to stand by them, going to support them, going to share the washing up, going to bathe their kids, then they'd be like, yeah, that's a better proposition. But who wants to take that financial hit? Then the second aspect is female labour force participation, right? So Malaysia has a fantastic rise of female graduates. And these are brilliant, ambitious, innovative women, right? These are the women that can drive Malaysia's future. You know, the future is female, as you say. So the question is, how can we support those women to both have families, so how can Malaysia be family friendly, and how can we keep those women in the workforce to harness all their ideas? You know, what's the point in educating all these women if, boom, we lose all that human capital?
I love that you've broken it down to us. So I want to ask you how this applies to, say, let's say, real world policy interventions.
Yes.
I remember speaking to a UN Demographics Department spokesperson. He said, any kind of fertility engineering by governments always has some unintended consequences. So, you know, you want to give an incentive for people to have more babies, doesn't really work at the end of the day. How do we think about creating an environment where you're supportive of fertility and you're growing a big workforce?
You're really right, because many countries have seen incredibly draconian policies about population. You know, for example, in India, they had mass sterilization with incentives, right? And we do not want to go down that road. We want to support families' choices. So how can we create an enabling environment? So, for example, if you look in Malaysia, it's actually very difficult to support a family and be a working mother. So, for example, many schools have the double day, right? The kids go in the morning or they go in the afternoon. Now, I understand the government is fiscally constrained, right? They may think we don't have enough teachers, we don't have enough schools. But that's not supporting families, right? Because if the school is stopping at 1 or 2, then what woman can get a job that's going to be part-time, low status, low paid? Because many women with only secondary education cannot afford to work. Right? Because they can't afford to care. It just does. So if you look at Malaysian female employment by age and by level of education, yes, it's increased, but it's much lower for the secondary school educated women who are on much lower pay. So if the school day stops halfway, that's not going to work. Whereas Thailand, the school day finishes at 3:30 and their female labour force participation is like 15 percentage points higher.
So single session schools actually help with female participation
There
in the
have been
workforce.
lots of studies on this in Latin America. When they extend the school day, a woman can get a decent job, earn money, pay for care, and so it's really hurting women. Another thing, in Malaysia, we've seen a big increase in childcare provision, both in terms of private and public. But the issue is that the 0 to 4, that's really undersupplied. So women with very young children have a difficulty. So we definitely need to build the infrastructure to support working families.
How do you propose we we change the gender norms in the home? So when you talk about the role of the father, the role of the father figure in the home with care work within the house, and you know, often behind closed doors, you never know really what's happening. So when we think about traditional gender roles, is that being challenged, particularly in dual income households?
Great point. So yes, culture is really important. And you know what, I mentioned that point about when jobs are scarce, you know, men have greater right. People who believe that in Malaysia are less likely to support women's work, and women are less likely to work in this family. So culture is really important. Now, actually here, I think we can learn from Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia, yeah, you were surprised by that.
I am surprised, yes.
Let me tell you. So Saudi Arabia has seen a big increase in female labour force participation over the 10 years. So how have they done this? It's actually been a top-down cultural strategy. So Shahid MBC is the Saudi state version of Netflix, right? And they promote a lot of films showing working women. Like there's the Egyptian version of The Good Wife, which you may have seen. There are lots of shows about like women chefs, women cooking. We're all women in doing all kinds of things. And they're basically showing women working is perfectly normal, it's perfectly acceptable, and it's totally fine. In England and the US, we also have lots of films about nannies. I don't know if you've ever seen Mary Poppins or Nanny McPhee, right? But no, I think that's a really important point, because lots of mothers, when I interview them, they can feel enormously guilty about leaving their children at home, right? You want to be the perfect mother. You want to, made a homemade meal to pick them up and collect them, or mothers can feel so guilty if they're not there at the school gates, etc. And that can eat them up. You know, I interviewed this woman. She started an amazing jewelry business, super entrepreneurial. She bought her own house, but she was still felt so bad that she wasn't there to care for her kids. And that anxiety, it can be really crippling. And so how do we tackle that? And I think normalizing nannies through films or normalizing hands-on fathers can make mothers feel less bad. So for example, my mother was a bit of a crap mother. And I say that in inverted commas. So my mother is a lawyer, you know, super loving. You know, she works super, super hard, super, super long days. So my brother and I in the mornings would make ourselves cereal, right? Okay. No one is making us a fancy breakfast, right? At the end of the day, you know, when we were little, we would cook our own dinner, right? Like a latchkey kid. Yeah, yes. latchkey kid who turns out fine, right? But, you know, if my mother had felt so terrible that she wasn't there to care for us and do, you know, make us a meal, then maybe she wouldn't have forged ahead in her legal career, right? I love the idea of culture being changed through popular culture, through media, through stories being told, representation on TV. How do we think about the right now with the rise of populism around the world? There is almost a backlash towards any kind of movement towards gender equality. Do you think that we are at risk of maybe undoing some of the progress that we've seen, stagnating even? What are your thoughts? I think that's a really great point. So I think every single society, due to its unique cultural inheritance and history, has a sort of a space of permissibility, right? The sort of things that are allowed. Is it the pendulum has swung too far? Well, at one edge you will always have progressives, at one end you will always have conservatives. And when progressive hit this way, the conservatives will get frightened, they'll get alarmed, and they'll double down, and they'll try to enforce institutions that prevent any of that naughtiness. So definitely we always see that tension. You know, even in the US, when they introduced the Equal Rights Amendment, men became more sexist than conservatives. So every single time it is that tussle, it is that fist fight. So I think one, that tension is inevitable. You know, even in the Middle East, in the 1950s and the 1960s, Egypt and Saudi Arabia increasingly introduced many progressive, secularizing reforms, and that triggered a religious backlash, right? So in Saudi Arabia, so definitely that's real, that's global. Could I just ask you, does that, in any way, does the kind of labels feed into this? Because we often think about liberal feminism as a label, and there is a certain reaction that people have. Does that come into play with the backlash that we're seeing? Definitely. So I think so let's say there's this space of permissibility. If the progressives push too far, they can trigger that backlash. So I think an important, a sensible, a sustainable way of progressive social change is to be careful not to inflame hostility, right? So if you're in a fairly conservative society and the progressives are going on, let me give the example of Pakistan. So Pakistan is a fairly patriarchal conservative society, but it also has some feminists, right? And they have the annual Aurat March where women will protest and they'll go out campaigning for women's rights. You know, if they push for slogans and ideas which are so far out of step with the Pakistani public, then that always triggers backlash. Similarly, you know, if we're framing things to a conservative audience, I think it helps to speak to common values. It helps to speak to shared values. I think most people across the world are pretty tribal. You know, they trust insiders. They trust people who are part of their team. So if you can say, no, I share these values with you. We have this all in common, and let's work in this way. So I think slowly, incrementally, keeping everyone together, and that's where economic growth is really important, because when everyone feels that we can all prosper together, maybe like Malaysia in the 1990s, then we can all, jump on board that train. So Hafiz Nur Shams is a great Malaysian economist, and he makes precisely this point, that economic growth enables that optimism, and that enables that project of social cohesion. Whereas if you think that the pie is limited and we're fighting over it, maybe that economics can be another sort of driver of zero-sum mentality. So to condense that, I definitely think you're right that progressive change can trigger backlash, and I think there are two ways to address that. One is to recognize where your society is at. So even if you're the most radical feminist, maybe don't go for that agenda. keep it more in tune with what's broadly supported, right? So in every society, you may have a hyper-educated liberal elite, you know, who's influenced by Western ideas, etc. And those ideas may not be supported by the broad majority, but there are many, many liberal egalitarian ideas that are widely supported, right? And so that kind of agenda can get traction. And I think recognizing that widespread values, harnessing those values, celebrating cohesion, etc., super, super valuable, super, super important.
Dr. Evans, the time has flown by, but in the minute or so that we have left, can I ask you, for the people watching at home who are curious to know what they can learn or do in their lives to maybe make society a little bit better for women and everyone in general, what is it that you'd like us to think about and consider today?
Well, I don't think it's for me to tell Malaysians what to do, right? I think Malaysians, you know, Malaysia is great, and I'm so grateful to be here in Kuala Lumpur, and I hope this is one of many, many visits. So I would not want to preach, but I think for me, looking at the evidence that a society becomes more gender equal, number one, with hands-on fathers, you know, men supporting women's progress, and that's how we all prosper together.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for chatting to me today. It's been wonderful. Thank you.
Thanks.
That's all we have for you on this episode of The Future is Female. I'm Melisa Idris, signing off for the evening. Thank you so much for watching. Good night.